right, without further ado, I'll introduce our very first speaker for today. She is Miss SEET XIAN HUI. XIAN HUI is a speech therapist. Yes, please give her a round of applause. So XIAN HUI is a speech therapist who has just returned to DES after completing her Master of Science, Speech and Language Pathology at the National University of Singapore. Prior to taking on her master's degree, XIAN HUI joined DES in 2015 as an educational therapist and completed her specialist diploma in educational therapy in 2015. Yes, in 2017, as part of a master's program, XIAN HUI embarked on a thesis project in collaboration with DES, where she investigated the oral language abilities of children with dyslexia using an assessment tool that she developed together with her classmate as well as her supervisors. She'll be presenting on assessing language in bilingual children with dyslexia. So let's put our hands together to welcome XIAN HUI.
Thank you, Ashkin. All right, so I'm XIAN HUI, and thank you so much for being here to watch this presentation. And I will be presenting on assessing language in bilingual children with dyslexia. So this was actually the research study that I conducted as my thesis last year. And to get the results for this study, I tested the language abilities of some of our students here at DAS. And then I compared their performance to the children, typically developing children that my classmate Simman assessed from MOE schools. Okay, so I will be giving you all some background information about this topic, and then followed by introducing to you guys my research questions, my methods, and finally sharing with you all my results from this study. Okay. And okay, just a quick overview of what I'll be covering for the background information. So firstly, I'll be talking about the relationship between dyslexia and developmental language disorder. So my study, the focus is on the children with only dyslexia, but I think it would be good if you also have a better understanding of what language disorder, DLD, is about. And then I will be talking about assessing language in Singapore. And finally, about sentence repetition tests. So that will be for the background information. Okay, so dyslexia, I'm sure many of you already know. It is a specific learning disability where the main impairment is in the children's written language abilities. So oftentimes it's associated with a phonological deficit, and then we see the children showing to have poor reading and spelling skills, although they have normal intelligence and they receive adequate learning opportunities. So we know that that is dyslexia, but seems like less is known about developmental language disorder, and it's interesting because this is a disorder that is frequently discussed alongside dyslexia in the research field. And so what is DLD? It was previously known as SLI. Some of you might have heard what SLI is about. It's a specific language impairment, and instead of a deficit in the written language, the deficit for DLD is mainly in the oral language. So the children have more difficulties in their non-phonological skills, such as the morphosyntax, vocabulary, and discourse. Discourse meaning like narrative abilities, and morphosyntax, you will see this word a lot in my presentation. It basically just means grammar. So these children are weaker in these skills, and to get this diagnosis of DLD, you have to show a profile of such difficulties causing functional impairments in your everyday life, and the prognosis is usually poor. So children with DLD would therefore see speech and language therapists like myself to help them work on these language difficulties. Okay, so some of you might already be thinking, now these two disorders sound quite similar. Are they really different? Because both are about language. Can a child have both dyslexia and DLD? Okay, so this has been discussed quite a lot over the years. So let me just take you all through a brief history. Back in 1986, dyslexia and DLD were thought of as just lying on a continuum. So on one end, you have dyslexia, when the difficulties are more mild. And then on the other end, on the other end, you have DLD, language disorder. So when everything is impaired, your oral language impaired, written language impaired, then they say, okay, so now it's DLD. But that was what was thought in 1986, and we have since moved on. In 2004, Bishop and Snowling described these two disorders as different, distinct, except that they share a phonological deficit, so there's a degree of overlap there. And then only the group with DLD have a non-phonological deficit. Okay, so that was in 2004, and then in 2005, this group of researchers proposed that, yes, the two disorders are distinct, but children can also have both dyslexia and DLD. And since then, quite a substantial amount of evidence have been presented to support this view. So this is our current understanding now, that the two disorders are distinct disorders. They are different. And there can be a group of children with just dyslexia, a second group with just DLD, and also a third group with both dyslexia and DLD. Okay, so, all right. As I mentioned earlier, my focus for this study is just on the group with only dyslexia. And my question is, do these children with only dyslexia really have no difficulties with their grammar? Okay, because there have been some findings that seem to suggest that the children with only dyslexia also have some difficulties in their grammar. And this is despite the fact that the researchers already excluded the children who also have a comorbidity of DLD. Okay, and but I have to say that our understanding of the grammatical abilities of children with dyslexia is still quite limited, because most of the time, people are still more focused on the reading and spelling abilities of these children. And when we are talking about grammar in our children here in Singapore, we are talking about assessment, right? We want to find out we want to assess their language abilities, their grammar abilities. Then we have to be quite careful when we take what has been found in other countries and generalize it over to our children here in Singapore. The reason being, we are talking about assessing language in Singapore, and this is quite a tricky issue. It's actually quite a challenging task to do, because our children, they are exposed to many languages, and on top of that, they are also exposed to what we know as Singlish, Singapore Colloquial English, where certain grammatical errors can be considered acceptable in our local population. So then if that's the case, we have to first find out what kind of grammatical errors are acceptable in Singapore and what kind are not. And since we are talking about assessment, I have a question for you all. So let's say this is an examiner telling this to a student or a participant, saying, I'm going to say a sentence. After that, I want you to repeat the sentence as accurately as you can. The sentence may be quite long. Are you ready? Okay, my question is, what skill do you all think the examiner is testing here? Okay, and I want to have a show of hands. Do you all think it's memory, language, or memory and language? Okay, so you can think about it first. So the examiner is saying, I want you to repeat the sentence. So it's a task of sentence repetition, right? Asking the child to just repeat after me. Okay, can I have a show of hands here? Who thinks it's memory? Okay, we have quite a few of you. And then who thinks it's language? It's testing the child's language. Okay, I don't see any hands. Who thinks it's memory and language? Okay, so most of you think that it's memory and language, and some of you did think it's memory also. In fact, when I asked this question to a few people that I know, without giving them the options, most of them said memory, that I'm just testing the child's memory. Okay, so how about, before I give you all the answer, let's try it out for ourselves, okay? So, So I'll play you guys a sentence, and I want you all to try to repeat it as accurately as you can. All right? Let me figure out how to play this. Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Έπρεπε να πάρει ένα μπλε στυλό.
Yeah, I can play it again, thank you.
Έπρεπε να πάρει ένα μπλε στυλό.
Okay, so not as easy as you all thought, right? It was quite a short sentence actually. So why was it difficult? Was it a memory issue or a language issue, right? Because you see that when you're asked to repeat a sentence, you don't just need to have good memory. It also is tapping on your language skills. You need to know the vocabulary. You need to know the words in the language, right? You need to understand it. You need to understand the sentence structure, the grammar. Understand that sentence, and it would be even better if you have used such words before verbally. If you have constructed such a sentence with such grammar, such sentence structure before, and that would help you repeat it accurately, right? So, asking someone to repeat a sentence is tapping on both their memory and language abilities. And in case you all are not convinced yet, there have been quite a bit of research supporting this, that test of sentence repetition taps on the child's phonological short-term memory, vocabulary, and morphosyntactic knowledge. And also, it has been proposed as a tool for identifying language deficits in children. Okay, and lastly, it has been found that the errors that young children make when they are asked to repeat a sentence is actually similar to the kind of errors that they make spontaneously. So for example, if a child were to always substitute a he for a she when I ask the child to repeat after me, I would expect this child to make such an error spontaneously also when he's talking to his friends, for example. Okay, so since we know that sentence repetition test is quite a sensitive tool to assess language, let me just give you a quick recap of what I have covered before I move on in my presentation. Okay, so I talked about how dyslexia and DLD are distinct disorders that may occur comorbidly, right? So we understand that now, and that I am looking at only the group with dyslexia. We know that they have a phonological deficit, but what about their non-phonological skills? Okay, and we now understand that it is difficult to assess language in Singapore, and so there is a need for a sensitive test of language, and we have the sentence repetition test. Okay, so there are many sentence repetition tests out there in the market, but Simon and we decided to design our own test, calling it the Singapore English Sentence Repetition Test, the SRep. And the reason being, we wanted to make sure that the content and words that we use would be suitable for our local population. We wanted to include a variety of sentences and also consider the common grammatical errors in Singapore Colloquial English and the kind of errors that were previously reported in children with dyslexia from other countries. And we wanted to come up with a scoring system where we can really categorize the kind of grammatical errors that the children are making so that we can do some fine-grained analysis and compare their performance to that of the typically developing kids. And lastly, we wanted to also investigate the effect of memory load on the child's performance. So to do that, we need to have both short and long sentences in our test. And so here's the design of the SRep test. We varied the sentences by length and canonicity. So length, that's quite straightforward, right? We have short and long sentences. And what is canonicity? Let me give you all some examples. If you look first at the left, okay, here I have, on the left, you have canonical sentences. So these are, to put it simply, just sentences with simple sentence structure. So they are declarative, they are active sentences. For example, they were running to the school hall. So I tell this to the child and ask the child to repeat after me. Okay, and I would expect that that should be quite an easy sentence to repeat. And then if you look on the left, you have non-canonical sentences. So these are sentences with more complex sentence structures. They can be coordinated, like the kind with a but, because, or interrogative, a question type. They could have relative clauses or be a passive sentence. For example, if you look at the bottom right, a long non-canonical sentence. The shells which she collected today look beautiful. I would expect more errors on this because of the more complex sentence structure here. Okay, so in total, I have 48 sentences in the test. So my research questions. The first research question is, do children with dyslexia have poorer oral language abilities than their typically developing peers? And this is excluding those with likely comorbidity of DLD, just the ones with dyslexia. And my prediction is that, yes, the group with dyslexia will perform significantly poorer than those without on their SRep test scores. And second question, do children with dyslexia have syntactical deficits, meaning more difficulties with the complex sentence structures? And are their difficulties only observed when the memory demands are high? My prediction is, yes, they will show to have more difficulties when the sentences are more complex, like the non-canonical sentences, and that should be seen even when the sentences are short. So supporting the view that it's not just a memory issue, it's also the language that is poorer than the typical kids. And lastly, I wanted to find out how would the morphosyntactic profile of children with dyslexia differ from that of their typically developing peers. So meaning I want to compare the kind of grammatical errors the children are making and see if the group with dyslexia is making more errors or even different types of errors. Okay, so these are the procedures. Simon and I first designed the SRep test. And then we recruited the students, primary 1 to 2 English-Mandarin bilingual kids. She recruited from MOE schools, I recruited from DAS. And then we collected our data. So each child, I tested each child for about 3 hours, split over 2 sessions at the DAS learning centers. And finally, I analyzed the data. For every child with dyslexia, I matched him or her with another typically developing kid on a few variables. So I will elaborate on this later. Okay, these are the tests that I administered. I tested their nonverbal IQ, literacy, verbal memory, vocabulary, core language abilities, and of course, I also administered the SRep test. Okay, let's look at these core language abilities. I administered the CELF-4. So this is a standardized assessment, language assessment tool that most speech therapists use to diagnose a language disorder. And the reason why I administered it is because I wanted to exclude the ones who seem to have language disorder, so that I can really ensure that my group only has dyslexia. And like I mentioned earlier, so this is a pair of children. So I have the ones with dyslexia and the one without. And they both have very similar age and non-verbal IQ scores. And I formed 10 of such pairs. So this is the profile for the dyslexic group and the typical group. So they are fairly similar, except for the fact that one has dyslexia, the other doesn't. And there are 10 pairs like this. Okay, so my results. To answer the first research question, whether the children with dyslexia have poorer oral language abilities, you see here their results on the language test. On the left, you see that the children do not differ significantly on the CELF, and then also on the BLAB vocabulary scores. So yes, they indeed do not have a language disorder, but if you look at their SRep test scores, the children are performing significantly poorer when I ask them to repeat a sentence, as compared to the typically developing kids. So this proves the hypothesis that the children with only dyslexia do have some difficulties with their oral language. And then, what kind of difficulties are those? We look at the results to the second research question. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, I have 4 types of sentences, right? And indeed, as I predicted, children with dyslexia, sorry, I forgot to mention the yellow bars are the ones with dyslexia. Okay, so they did perform significantly poorer on the non-canonical sentences, so the ones that have more complex sentence structures. And this shows that it seems like they do have some syntactical deficits here, right? And we see this even when the sentences are short. So really, it is a language issue. And actually, on top of this, I did get a finding that was quite unexpected, that the group with dyslexia also performed poorer when the sentences were short and canonical. So these are the more simple sentences, but they also performed poorer. And it could be because the group with dyslexia had more morphosyntactic errors, even when the sentences were short and simple, and I will go into that later also. Okay, if we look on the left, okay, if I ask you to repeat a short sentence, and then ask you to repeat a long sentence, I would expect that your accuracy would drop, right, from short to long. And yes, we saw that for all the children, except that the group with dyslexia had a significantly greater drop in their accuracy when we moved from short to long sentences, only when the sentences were non-canonical, more complex. So you see that the children with dyslexia were more affected by an increase in memory demand when the sentences are non-canonical. Okay, so this shows that they do have some syntactical deficits. Okay, we come to the results to the third research question. This is my favorite part of the study, actually. I thought the results were quite interesting. If you look on the left, I categorized the type of grammatical errors. Let's first look at the profile for the typically developing kids. Okay, so this is a chart on their error percentage, and meaning the higher the bar, the more errors they are making. And this is the typically developing group. So, for example, if you look at the kind of errors they are making on subject pronouns, the bar there is the shortest, right? The second bar, and that shows that this group of children do not tend to make errors on subject pronouns. And if they do, it's yellow, so if they do, it's a error of substitution. For example, substituting he for a she. Then you look at the tallest bar. So that shows that the typically developing kids tend to make the most errors on third person singular, meaning like you see that it's dark, right? So that's an error of omission. They tend to omit the S, for example, in he sings, they say he sing. So that is very common in our typical kids. Okay, then we look at a group with dyslexia and we see whether their profile is any different or even more colorful. Okay, so these are the results for the dyslexic kids. And it is indeed more colorful, indicating that they are making different types of errors actually. Let's put them side by side. And the group with dyslexia is making significantly more errors on articles, reflexive pronouns, and prepositions. Okay, significantly more, and also different types of errors. So, and also again, before I go into detail analyzing the three types of errors here, you see again the tallest bars are the ones on third person singular. So indeed, errors on third person singular should not be considered a language problem in Singapore because these are very common in our population here. Although such an error would be considered a language problem in other countries. And okay, so let's look at their errors on articles. Both groups of children tend to make such an error where they omit the article. For example, she owns the dog, they say she owns dog. And also, you see the yellow section, so they're also substituting it for another article. Instead of the dog, they say a dog. But only the group with dyslexia would make such an error, substituting the to a word of another class. For example, the dog, they say her dog. So that changes the meaning a bit. Okay, then we look at the errors on reflexive pronouns. This one's quite interesting. You see that all children tend to make such an error. Won herself a prize, they say won a prize. Okay, so that's not really a big issue. But only the children with dyslexia would substitute the reflexive pronoun for a non-word. For example, slips by himself, they say slips by he-self. And I have to say that for all of the children that I tested, so all the dyslexic kids, made this error, where they substituted the himself for he-self. And when I checked this with Simman, who tested the typical kids, she told me that none of the typical children make such an error. So it really is an error that is just specific to the group with dyslexia. Okay, and then on prepositions, both groups of children would substitute the preposition for another one. Pointed at, they say pointed to, not really a big issue. But only the group with dyslexia would just omit the whole preposition. So instead of pointed at the new bus stop, they say pointed the new bus stop. Okay. So to recap, the group with dyslexia are making significantly more errors on articles, reflexive pronouns, and prepositions, and also different types of errors. And this is despite the fact that they do not have a language disorder. Okay, so those were my results, and of course we can draw some clinical implications from that. The SRep test, it is a relatively easy test to administer. So perhaps teachers or educational therapists and speech therapists could administer it to test the language abilities of the children. And, or they could also use the results to justify their referrals to speech therapists. And speech therapists could also refer to the morphosyntactic profiles that we obtain from the SRep test when they are making their differential diagnosis. So to see whether this child seems to be making the kind of errors that are common in dyslexic kids, but this child seems to be making additional type of errors. So perhaps that looks more like a language disorder. So that would be quite useful. And also, like what I mentioned earlier, omission of inflections on third person singular should not be used as a marker of language deficit in Singapore, although it is so in other countries. Okay, and the profile of errors obtained could facilitate intervention planning. If we know where the children are weaker, are making more errors at, perhaps that could help us plan what we want to teach them. Okay, so as with any study have, there were some limitations for my study. The first and most obvious one would be the small sample size, that I only gathered these results from 10 pairs of students. And of course, I wanted to test more students, but I had to exclude many of them, many of the ones that I tested, because a lot of them seem to perform very poorly on the CELF, indicating that they might have a language disorder. So here you see that the comorbidity of dyslexia and language disorder is quite high. So I ended up with only 10 children with just dyslexia, and to address that limitation, I did the match pair analysis and made sure that they are really quite similar to the typical kids, so that I can make a more fair comparison. And so because of this limitation, I hope that in the near future, I can collect more data on larger sample size at DAS using the same or improved procedures. And also, my results, the generalizability of my results may be quite limited because I did not factor in the severity of dyslexia. We know that some of our kids are more mildly dyslexic, some are more severely dyslexic. That could have contributed to their performance. So that was not factored in. And also, the group of children that I looked at, they are English-Mandarin bilingual, English dominant. And we know very well that we have other language groups here in Singapore. So hopefully, more systematic investigations can be conducted so that we can get a profile of children with varying severity or type of dyslexia, or even the profile of children with DLD. That would be very useful for speech therapists. And also a profile for the bilingual language groups, other bilingual groups in Singapore. For example, the ones who have English as their second language. It would be interesting to know what kind of errors they are making. Okay, and to be honest, analyzing the scores on the SRep test took me a bit of time because you saw that I tried to categorize whether they were errors of omission or substitution and so on. So that was quite time consuming, and I hope that I can perhaps simplify the SRep scoring process so that it will be more practical for clinicians to administer it in their practice. Okay, so to conclude, my results show that children with dyslexia, no DLD, display specific grammatical errors, grammatical deficits when compared to their typical peers. And they also present with more difficulties when their sentences were more complex, so syntax difficulties, which were more evident under high memory demands. And also, if you remember, they did so even when the sentences were short. So that shows that we cannot exactly just account for their difficulties with using their working memory limitations. Okay, and also we find that the children with dyslexia tend to make more errors on articles, reflexive pronouns, and prepositions. And with that, I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.